but I think all people who have psychedelic trips and meditations and so on are poking more or less into the same higher realm and receiving some information from there. If we can develop this could be absorbed into ordinary science that we could approach with the scientific method and so on, then our intelligence, our capability of survival on planet Earth would be increased. I mean, we're a dying species. We live on a dying planet. We're killing the planet. So our disease is extremely serious. And therefore, we're desperate to find new information, ideas, and so on that can transcend. We have to evolve. And I think our intellectual evolution may be predicated upon the psychedelic pioneers.
I should add to Maria's account that when Carol and I got here without passports, it actually was a very nice gesture on the part of the Irish government to arrange it, because they knew that I was coming here as a guest of Amnesty International to speak at a campaign they were conducting, condemning the government for its participation in the globalized terror campaign at Shannon Airport. But they went ahead anyway. Well, you've seen the title, I guess. It's a question: can civilization survive really existing capitalism? In referring to really existing capitalism, I have in mind what really exists and is called capitalism, though whether that's what it should be called is another question. And the United States is the most important example for obvious reasons. The term itself, capitalism, is vague enough so that it can cover a great many possibilities. In fact, that's illustrated by the fact that it is used to describe the United States, the U.S. economic system, which deviates quite crucially from market capitalism, free market capitalism, as indeed did Britain before it. And in fact, every other developed society. The only societies that could authentically be called capitalism are the ones that had free markets rammed down their throat by imperial powers. They're what we now call the third world, not least for that reason. It's worth bearing in mind how the scale of the departures of really existing capitalism from the official doctrine, free market capitalism. So keep to the United States to mention just a few examples. In the past 20 years, the share of profits of the largest 200 corporations in the United States has risen very sharply, partly as a result of the internet, which was supposed to have the opposite effect, but it's having the effect of intensifying the oligopolistic character of the core U.S. economy. So and in another sector, the largest banks with trillions of dollars of assets have repeatedly merged to become still larger. By now, the six largest, the ones largely responsible for the current global financial crisis, they've increased their assets from 18% of gross domestic product 20 years ago to 63% today. Oligopoly, of course, undermines markets. It leads automatically to collusion to prevent price wars, which the competitors don't want, and to turn to mostly meaningless product differentiation to try to get people to buy their goods instead of someone else's identical ones. That's done through massive advertising. Advertising itself, it was a huge industry, maybe marketing, maybe a sixth of gross domestic product. Advertising is explicitly devoted to undermining markets. taken an economics course, you know that markets are supposed to be based on informed consumers making rational choices, which is not exactly what you see if you turn on the television set. Creativity and innovation have also substantially been in the public sector, not much appreciated. So turn to Alan Greenspan, back in the days when he was still revered as Saint Alan. That was before the crash that was caused in no small part by adherence to the fundamentalist market doctrines that he preached. Back then, in his glory days, he gave a speech to editors in which he extolled the wonders of our free market system with a system of free enterprise based on entrepreneurial initiative and consumer choice. But he made a mistake. He actually listed examples. Every example that he listed was a textbook case of the crucial role of the state sector all the way through. There was actually one exception, which was an instructive one in itself, namely transistors. Transistors were developed at a private laboratory, Bell Telephone Laboratories. And the lab was a great lab for a long time. That's when AT&T had a government-insured monopoly over telephone service, so it could therefore impose monopoly pricing, had great resources, it could use them to establish a terrific lab. As soon as the company was broken up, the lab had to be dismantled. It's still there, but it's now devoted to the short-term applications for the industry. Furthermore, the transistor development, though it did take place in the lab, was based extensively on wartime technology, Second World War technology, which is, of course, all in the state sector. And there was no market for high-end transistors. They were much too expensive. So therefore, the government bought 100% of them. Procurement, incidentally, is a major form of government subsidy to industry. Actually, there's a kind of an analog here in the way the core sectors of the Irish economy have developed. Construction services, very substantially through government kind of procurement, paying them off to do things for which there's no demand. St. Allen's speech, incidentally, was at the same time when he was testifying to Congress and soberly explaining the wonders of the great economy that he was directing to great acclaim at the time, which he attributed to what he called growing worker insecurity. That is, intimidating workers so that they won't make any irrational efforts to try to keep wages up to inflation, let alone up to productivity, which they ought to be kept up to. That's an obvious contribution to the health of the economy under really existing capitalism. Computers and the internet, and in fact the basic components of the IT revolution, they were in the state sector for substantially for decades before they were handed over to private companies for marketing and profit. That includes the creative and innovative research and development, subsidies, procurement, and other devices. Again, very little role for consumer choice and entrepreneurial initiative, at least in the difficult and risky period, except for the initiative in getting government subsidy for what you're doing. And the same is true of much of the high-tech economy, and it traces far back, actually back to the early days of English industrialization. In one domain, the financial sector, state intervention is notorious, and it's expanded enormously, of course, in the past generation. In the United States, it's hard to remember, but back in the 50s and 60s, during the big growth period, the banks were banks. Put your money in them, they lent money to some presumably useful purposes, that was it. No interstate banks, no financial crises. That changed in the past generation. And now they're firms devoted to complex and risky transactions. And they have grown enormously in the US at the time of the crash, 2007. They had risen to 40% of corporate profits. Now, the way they can get away with this is because they rely very heavily on a government insurance policy, tacit insurance policy. Informally, it's called too big to fail. That provides the biggest banks with great advantages. The scale has been roughly estimated by economists at maybe $40 billion a year or so. However, there's a recent study by the IMF that indicates that that may be a considerable underestimate. I'll quote the business press reporting the study. It says, perhaps the largest US banks aren't really profitable at all, and the billions of dollars they allegedly earn for their shareholders were almost entirely a gift from the US taxpayers in a variety of ways, including bailout, but many other things like cheap credit and so on. That's more evidence to support a judgment by the most respected financial correspondent in the English-speaking world, Martin Wolf of the London Financial Times. He describes what he says is that an out-of-control financial sector is eating out the modern market economy from inside, just as the larva of a spider wasp eats out the host in which it's been laid. It's an observation with a certain grim resonance right here. It is thanks to the lavish contributions of the taxpayer unwittingly to maintaining this destructive system. The term capitalism is also used for many other systems. It's sometimes used for systems that have no capitalists at all, like the great Mondragon conglomerate in the Basque Country, or the worker-owned enterprises that are springing up in the decaying Rust Belt of the United States. Some might even use the term capitalism to include some version of the industrial democracy that was advocated, among others, by John Dewey, America's leading social philosopher in the last century. He called for workers to be, what, in his words, masters of their own industrial fate, and for all institutions to be under public control, including the means of production, exchange, publicity, transportation, and communication. Short of this, Dewey concluded, politics will remain the shadow cast by big business over society. His major work, as some of you know, was on democracy, and that was his conception of democracy. And he was condemning the truncated version of democracy that really existed. By now, it's been left in tatters, much worse than when he described. By now, control of the government, I'm again talking about the United States, but not very different elsewhere. Control of government is very narrowly concentrated at the peak of the income scale. The large majority down below are effectively disenfranchised. That's been shown pretty well by just mainstream political science. It's one of the major topics is investigating the very rich poll data, so you know what people think, and of course you can take a look at policies so you can compare them. And recent research right in the mainstream estimates that the lower 70% on the income wealth scale have essentially no influence on policy. So they are effectively disenfranchised. Influence increases slowly as you move up the rest of the scale. When you get to the very top, they get what they want. There's always been a lot of truth to that, but it's increased enormously during the past 30-odd years of the neoliberal period, really an assault on the population. Very harmful just about everywhere it's been applied. You've suffered from it here. The current political economic system is actually a form of plutocracy. It's very misleading to call it democracy. Diverges radically from democracy, if by democracy we mean political arrangements in which what the public thinks has some influence on policy. There have been serious debates, academic debates over the years, about whether capitalism is in principle consistent with democracy. But if we talk about really existing capitalism, the question's answered. Certainly not. Really existing capitalist democracy, for short, RECD, you can pronounce it RECT if you like, they are radically incompatible. That's easily demonstrated. For reasons to which I'll return, it seems to me unlikely that civilization can survive really existing capitalism and the sharply attenuated democracy that goes along with it. Now, an important question is whether actual democracy, functioning democracy, might make a difference. Well, it's hard to speculate about non-existent systems, but there's some reason to believe that it would. So let's just keep to the most critical, immediate problem that civilization faces. There's plenty of them, but this is the primary one, environmental catastrophe. Policies and public attitudes differ quite sharply in the United States. That's commonly the case under RECT, but strikingly in this case. Actually, there's an issue of the last issue of the Journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which goes into this. I'll read some quotes. The researchers found that 109 countries have enacted some form of policy regarding renewable power, and 118 countries have set targets for renewable energy. In contrast to this 100 plus, the United States has not adopted any consistent and stable set of policies at the national level to foster the use of renewable energy. Now it's not public opinion that's driving policy off the international spectrum. Quite the contrary. The public is much closer to the global norm than policy is, and much more supportive of actions to confront the likely environmental disaster that we're facing, maybe not too far off, could be lives of our grandchildren. Here's what the researchers found, the same issue. Huge majorities of the public have favored steps by the federal government to reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions generated when utilities produce electricity. In 2006, 86% of respondents favored requiring utilities, or at least encouraging them with tax breaks, to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases they emit. Also in that year, 87% favored tax breaks for utilities that produce more electricity from water, wind, or sunlight. And these majorities have been maintained up to the most recent studies. Very sharply different from policies, I just quoted. Well, the fact that the public is influenced by science is deeply troubling to those who dominate the economy and largely control state policy. And it's a very interesting current illustration of that. There's an organization called ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. It's a corporate-funded organization that writes legislation that they try to induce states to adopt. They have a new program. It's called an Environmental Literacy Improvement Act. The act is intended for schools K to 12, kindergarten to 12th grade. And the act, I'm quoting it now, The Act mandates balanced teaching of climate science through these years. Balanced teaching is a code phrase that means teaching climate change denial in order to balance mainstream climate science. It's analogous to what's called balanced teaching that's advocated by creationists to enable the teaching of creation science in the schools. And in fact, legislation based on this act has already been introduced by a number of states. ALEC has plenty of clout because of the enormous corporate funding behind it. Of course, all of this is dressed up in rhetoric about the wonders of critical thinking, no doubt a fine idea, but you can think up better choices than an issue that threatens decent survival and by accident happens to contribute to corporate profits. The ALEC legislation is based on a proposal, a project of the Heartland Institute. That's a corporate-funded institute that's dedicated openly to rejection of the scientific consensus on climate change. The institute project calls for a global warming curriculum for K-12 classrooms. It aims to teach that there is a major controversy over whether or not humans are changing the weather. And in fact, there is a controversy. It's regularly reported in the media. On one side, you have the overwhelming majority of scientists, all the world's major national academies of science, all the professional science journals, the IPCC, the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That's one side. They all agree that global warming is taking place, that there's a substantial human component, that the situation is serious and perhaps dire, and that very soon, maybe within decades, the world might reach a tipping point where there's nothing to do about it. The process will begin to escalate sharply and will be irreversible with very severe economic and social effects. It's pretty rare to find a consensus of that nature on a complex scientific issue. There is another side. It consists of skeptics, including a few serious, respected scientists who caution correctly that much remains unknown, which means it might not be as bad as anticipated, or it might be worse. Only the first part is reported. And then omitted from the contrived debate altogether is a much larger group of skeptics. These are highly regarded climate scientists, happens to include the climate change group in my own university, MIT, and they regard the regular reports of the IPCC as much too conservative. And they've been repeatedly proven correct, unfortunately, but they're not part of the public debate, although they're very prominent in the scientific literature. Well, the Heartland Institute and ALEC are just one part of a huge campaign by corporate lobbies to sow doubts about the near unanimous consensus of scientists that human activities are having a major impact on global warming with possibly ominous implications. And there's nothing hidden about the campaign. It's quite public. It's been openly announced. That includes, of course, the major lobbies of the fossil fuel industry. It includes the American Chamber of Commerce, which is the major business lobby, and others. The efforts of ALEC and the famous Koch brothers you've probably read about, however, are a fraction of what's underway. There's a great deal more which is concealed in complex ways. Every once in a while, something leaks out. There was a story in the London Guardian recently by Suzanne Goldenberg. She finds that conservative billionaires used a secretive funding route to channel nearly $120 million, that's last year, to more than 100 groups casting doubt about the science behind climate change, helping to build a vast network of think tanks and activist groups working to a single purpose, to redefine climate change from neutral scientific fact to a highly polarizing wedge issue for hardcore conservatives. And the propaganda campaign has apparently had some effect on public opinion in the United States, which is a little more skeptical than the global norm, not much. But the effect is not significant enough to satisfy the masters, and that's why you have sectors of the corporate world that are launching their attack on the educational system in an effort to counter the dangerous tendency of the public to pay attention to the overwhelming conclusions of scientific research. A couple of months ago, there was a meeting of the Republican National Committee, if you read about it. One governor, Governor Bobby Jindal of Louisiana, warned the Republican leadership, his words, "We must stop being the stupid party. We must stop insulting the intelligence of voters." But ALEC and its corporate sponsors disagree. They want to go much farther, turning it into the stupid nation. And they're doing it for quite principled reasons. And these are rooted in these central institutions of RECT. One of the dark money organizations that's funding climate change denial is a group called Donors Trust. It's also a major contributor to efforts to deny voting rights to poor blacks in the United States, poor generally. There's a good reason for that. It's perfectly sensible. They tend to be Democrats. If you look at their attitudes, they even tend to be social democrats, welfare state measures and things like that. They might even go so far as to pay attention to science, unlike those who are trained properly in critical thinking by balanced teaching. And these efforts direct attention to another aspect of RECT, which is quite important. Roughly half the population in the United States doesn't vote. And if you look at the non-voters, it's skewed towards the lower end of the income scale, heavily in fact. And overwhelmingly, they identify themselves as Democrats, and their attitudes tend towards social democratic. There has been no serious inquiry into why they don't vote. Probably one reason is the many barriers that are placed in their way. These are modern versions of the old poll tax and other devices that were designed to keep the rabble in their place. But it's likely that one reason is that without studying the professional literature, they just know that their opinions don't matter, even if expressed in the ballot box. So why take the trouble? Well, turning to the most serious threat to decent survival, the major science journals regularly give a sense of how surreal is this corporate campaign to produce a stupid nation. So take Science, the major scientific weekly in the United States. A couple of months ago, it had 3 items, side by side, news items. One of them reported that 2012 was the hottest year on record in the United States. That continues a long trend. The second reported a new study by the U.S. Global Climate Change Research Program, which provided additional evidence for that rapid climate change is the result of human activities. They also discussed likely more severe impacts. And a third news item reported the appointments to chair the committees on science policy that were chosen by the U.S. House of Representatives. Now, the House of Representatives is overwhelmingly Republican, though the votes for House are overwhelmingly Democratic. Last election was striking. That's another consequence of the shredding of the political system. Well, there are 3 chairs. All 3 of them deny that humans contribute to climate change, 2 deny that it's even taking place. The same issue of the journal has a technical article with new evidence that the irreversible tipping point may be much closer than anticipated. That was followed a couple of weeks later by another report in Science that underscores the need to ensure that Americans become the stupid nation. This report provides evidence that even slightly warmer temperatures, less than anticipated, could start melting permafrost, which in turn could, it's well known, could trigger the release of huge amounts of very dangerous greenhouse gases, worse than carbon dioxide, which are trapped in ice. So it's best to keep to balanced education, at least if you can face the grandchildren whose lives you're destroying. Well, within RECT, it's extremely important as an institutional necessity that the U.S. become the stupid nation, not misled by science and rationality, in the interests of short-term gains of the masters of the economy and the political system. That's not easy to change because it's built into the institutional structures of the society. Actually, these same people who are making these decisions in their individual lives may be contributing to environmental groups. They can read the science journals as well as anyone else. But in their institutional function, they're bound by the structure of those institutions, which again makes it very hard to change and explains why policies like this are necessary. And the drive for stupidity goes well beyond climate change. So federal funding for fundamental R&D, research and development, has been dropping sharply as a share of GDP as compared with other countries. The editor of Science, leading science journal in the US, he describes the government as deranged, sacrificing tremendous future benefits on the altar of short-term profit and delusions, and they are delusions, about debt, which are driven mainly by the financial institutions, much as in Europe, where in fact it's even more severe than in the United States. These commitments are deeply rooted in the fundamentalist doctrines that are preached within RECT, although observed in a highly selective manner if you look closely. We're given a couple of examples, because it's also necessary to preserve a very powerful state to serve the interests of wealth and power. It's what economist Dean Baker calls a conservative nanny state. Well, it goes beyond this. Market fundamentalism has a number of built-in, and in fact quite well-known, deleterious effects. So one, which is not discussed enough, is that market fundamentalism, while it pretends to expand choices, in fact sharply restricts them. So for example, if I have to get home from work, I have a choice in the market as to whether to buy a Toyota or a Chevy, let's say. But I can't choose between buying a car and having a public transportation system. That's not a choice that's open in principle in a market system. It requires collective decision making, and that's not an option. And in fact, it's under RECT, with the tattering of democracy, it's a diminishing option. And you can see the consequences. So for example, you can take a high-speed train from Beijing to Kazakhstan, and it'll probably soon go all the way to Turkey. But you can't take a high-speed train in the most heavily traveled corridor in the world, the Northeast Corridor in the United States, from Boston to Washington. In fact, the trains there are barely faster than they were 60 years ago when my wife and I first took them. And that's a natural aspect of RECT, really existing capitalism with a tattered democratic system. There are also what are called market inefficiencies in the professional literature. One of them, a serious one, is perfectly well known, gets a footnote in every economics text, is the failure to take into account the effect on others in a market transaction, so-called externalities. These externalities can be quite substantial. That's even true of simple transactions among individuals. When you move on to major institutions, they become huge. In fact, the current financial crisis is an illustration. It's partially traceable, substantially traceable, to the ignoring of what's called systemic risk. That is the risk that if some risky transaction has taken place, maybe the whole system will collapse. That's not a new discovery, incidentally. 15 years ago, the height of the euphoria about efficient markets, there were two prominent economists, one English, one American, John Eatwell and Lance Taylor. They wrote an important book, Global Finance at Risk, in which they spelled out the consequences of these market inefficiencies and dire consequences. We're now living with another one, will be worse to come. And they suggested means to deal with them, which of course were disregarded. There's another major international economist, David Felix, has been warning about this for many years, ever since the liberalization of capital in the 70s. He's been warning that the increasing frequency of financial crises during the period of financial liberalization could terminate in an uncontrollable one. And he had good arguments for it. In fact, there was plenty of evidence that was beginning to happen. But these voices were unheard during the corporate-sponsored deregulatory rage with, incidentally, the intellectual backing of theses about efficient markets and rational behavior that had no empirical basis, but were proclaimed with great confidence within the economics profession between every two market collapses. The minutes of the Federal Reserve, the U.S. Central Bank, which are released after 5 years. It's quite an open society, the U.S. You can learn a lot about what's going on. They've just released the 2007 transcripts, and they make interesting reading. 2007, the whole system was crashing. But here's a group of very distinguished economists and major banking system professionals. They couldn't see that the huge housing bubble, which is based on no economic fundamentals, by then had reached $8 trillion of meaningless paper money, that it was happening. There's nothing in the transcripts to recognize what's happening before their eyes. And there's a good reason. There's a religion. The religion is market fundamentalism. It preaches that markets are efficient and investors are rational. So what's happening can't be happening. So therefore we march ahead into the next disaster. Well, after the predicted disaster occurred, there were a few people predicted it, leading economists, again, right in the mainstream, reported what they called an emerging consensus on the need for macroprudential supervision of financial markets. That is, paying attention to the general stability of the financial system and not only its individual parts. Two prominent international economists stated that there's a growing recognition that our financial system is running a doomsday cycle. Whenever it fails, we rely on lax money and fiscal policies to bail it out. This response teaches a lesson to the financial sector. Take large gambles, get paid handsomely, and don't worry about the costs because they'll be paid by taxpayers. And the financial system is thus resurrected, they say, to gamble again and to fail again, worse each time. The official of the Bank of England, who's responsible for financial stability after the later crisis, described it as a doom loop. Well, There is legislation being considered in the United States. It's the so-called the Dodd-Frank bill. It's supposed to put Band-Aids on the sores, doesn't go very deep. But it's, as always, being whittled down by armies of corporate lobbyists who are not countered. There are no lobbyists for the public interest under RECT, just for the banks. It's very unlikely that much will come of the legislation after they're done with it. So we'll march on to the next and probably even worse crisis. It's been a regular occurrence over the past 30 years, ever since Reagan in the United States, and none before. No crises before, because the New Deal regulations were in place, and there were capital controls on international financial flows up until 1970, incidentally under IMF rules, which still exist. It's now forgotten, but they are in fact being instituted again, most recently in Cyprus, to try to overcome the latest European catastrophe under the suicidal policies of austerity during stagnation, which fail miserably every time they're applied, although failure is a misleading word because they work quite well for the designers of the policy. They just fail for the people, general people, and that's a significant fact. Actually, there's an interesting booklet that just came out in the United States, published by the Economics Policy Institute. It's the major source of regular economic data about the state of the economy and working people. The pamphlet's called Failure by Design. They review the policies of the past 30-odd years, the neoliberal period, and they review I won't give the data, they review what's familiar from what's happened to the public over this period. The enormous, tremendous concentration of wealth way at the top 10th of 1%, stagnation or decline for large majority, a deterioration of relatively weak benefit systems, and so on. The pamphlet is called Failure by Design. But they point out design because there always were alternative policies, well-known ones. But they point out that's a class-based failure. For the designers, it's a fantastic success. You know, they're richer than imaginable and doing better all the time. Every time there's disaster, they come out better. Corporate profits, for example, are at record highs in the United States. Corporations have so much money, they don't know what to do with it. They don't invest it because there's no demand, but so they use it for financial speculation, and the banks are bigger and richer than before the crisis that they caused. So it's failure by design and class-based failure, and pretty much the same is true of Europe. You should be careful when people talk about these as failed or, as I just did, suicidal policies. Well, there's a far more serious example of the danger of ignoring externalities, the ones that are dismissed to a footnote under market fundamentalist doctrine, and that's the environmental catastrophe. Here, the externality that's ignored is the fate of the species. And in this case, there's no one to run to, cap in hand, to be asked to be bailed out. Taxpayer can't help on this one. Well, these consequences have very deep roots in RECT and its guiding doctrines, which also dictate that the masters will make major efforts to escalate the threats, even though they're quite aware of them. Again, institutional fact. That's one reason, and not the only one, why it seems quite unlikely that civilization will survive RECT without serious blows. Well, if there are historians in the future, there may not be, but if there are, they're going to see they look back on this period, they're going to see a very strange phenomenon developing under our eyes. With eyes open, the world is marching towards serious disaster. No secret, eyes open, facts are there, read it right in front of you. And there are, of course, efforts to counter it. They vary. And they vary in an interesting way. The most far-reaching efforts to counter the crisis are found in pre-industrial societies, what are called primitive societies, where they don't have the benefit of education. Indigenous societies, tribal societies, First Nations, and so on. And the most strenuous efforts to escalate the threats are in the most advanced, most educated, richest, and most powerful societies. So take the Western Hemisphere. Ecuador, which has a large indigenous population and is an oil producer, is undertaking efforts under the pressure of the indigenous population to get support from Europe, which they surely won't get, to leave the oil in the ground where it ought to be and turn to other forms of growth and development. That's the poor, uneducated, indigenous societies. Bolivia, which has an even bigger indigenous population, is way in the lead internationally in doing something about this. Then you go to the other extreme, up north, United States and Canada. They're racing madly to try to get the crisis to be as rapid and as extreme as possible. That's what's called, you read the enthusiastic, euphoric reports about a century of energy independence, which are all over the newspapers, including the financial newspapers, and both political parties agree it's really a great thing. We're going to have 100 years of energy independence by trying to get every drop of fossil fuels out of the ground, including things like Canadian tar sands, which are extremely damaging to the environment, the local and, in fact, global environment. But we got to do that. And the energy independence is almost totally meaningless. So we have to make sure that the crisis is as quick and bad as possible. All of these euphoric discussions don't raise the question, what's the world going to look like in 100 years? That's somebody else's business. Within RECT, you don't ask that question. Well, that's the scene that a future historian will see, if there is one to look back, and it'll be a pretty striking one. And it's up to us, actually, to decide if that scenario is going to happen. It's very imminent. Thanks.
As valuable as my DMT experiences have been, I feel that there's a lot more enduring value, really, in this folk technology, which stretches it out and makes it a navigable space. Our whole Western, European-derived tradition of distilling alcohols and isolating chemicals and making everything stronger and taking it out of nature and putting it into the biggest punch that we can, I don't think that generally that's the most useful way. I think there's a reason that cultures have learned to turn a 5-minute experience into a 5-hour experience. It seems to me that ayahuasca has had a plan, and that it's reached out into the world and brought DMT into many, many thousands of lives in a much bigger canvas than it had reached for the last 10,000 or however many years. And it's done it very rapidly, and it's done it with form to go with it.